Let's try a thought experiment. Close your eyes and within your own mind, try to conjure up the image of a puppy. What breed of dog is it? What is it doing? How would you describe the mental scenario in your head to someone else? It would probably be pretty straightforward, right? People do this all the time. That's something wonderful about the human mind. It can take the abstractions from within your head and put it into a form that others can understand. And that's all well and good, but allow me to ask you this question. How do you describe something that defies any known reality, something that defies any point of reference residing in the perceivable, tangible world, something indescribable? Welcome everyone to On Thin Ice. I'm Philip, and today we're going to be diving into one of the most influential stories of all time, and one of the most valiant attempts at describing the indescribable, Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy. First things first, just let me fanboy out for a bit. This story is one of the enduring literary achievements in all of human history, and for good reason. Those of you who have already read it, or even portions of it, know what I mean. It's simply fantastic. Because this story is such a big deal, I've taken the production process of this episode very seriously. Through my commitment to creating a quality production, I hope to achieve two goals. First, I want you all to know just how important and influential the Inferno truly is. Second, I want you all to read it for yourselves. I have my own opinions and thoughts on the book, of course, and we'll be getting into a lot of what I think. But I find it very important for people to have their own ideas when it comes to culturally transcendent stories like this one. Such a grand tale indeed, but where to begin? Having given it some thought, I find it important to provide you with some religious context. So let's talk about medieval Catholicism and what the religious climate was in the 1300s. At this time, the Vatican was very much entrenched in the affairs of the Italian government in several aspects. The Crusades were still happening, and generally the church had a strong influence on the daily lives of its followers. This ideological stranglehold would collapse with the onset of the Italian Renaissance. But at this moment in history, the medieval ways of worship were very much still in place. So, what did the church teach its followers concerning the afterlife? Essentially, there were three possible outcomes: Paradiso, or heaven, Purgatorio, or purgatory, and Inferno, or hell. Paradiso was reserved for the righteous, and Inferno was designated to punish the wicked and unrepentant. There was no mobility whatsoever between these two layers, with movement only being possible via Purgatorio, which essentially is a state between heaven and hell. It is possible for souls to move from Purgatorio to either Paradiso or Inferno, but it is also possible to simply remain in Purgatorio forever. This mobility is made possible only by the prayers of the living on behalf of the souls of the dead. Members of the Catholic faith were told that Inferno was suffering beyond comprehension, with each person suffering according to their sins. This begs the question, what does suffering without end look like? How can our puny mortal minds grasp such a sublime, eternally horrifying concept? Enter our author-poet. Dante Alighieri was born in 1265 and lived his life as a proud resident of Florence, Italy. A side note on politics. During the years in question, Italy was not a unified nation. Rather, they were a collection of dispersed and fiercely independent city-states, such as Florence, Venice, and Milan. It was far more common to align your identity with your particular city-state, as opposed to Italy as a whole, and Dante was a very proud Florentine. Despite his love for Florence, it was experiencing some serious political upheaval, and unfortunately for Dante, he would be caught on the wrong end of a government takeover. Due to the actions he undertook while holding political office, he was exiled permanently from Florence in 1302. It was during this period of exile that Dante began to write a poem he referred to simply as comedy, which he published in sections between 1308 and 1321. Only after its meteoric rise in popularity did it become known as the Divine Comedy. The narrative follows the main character, who is Dante himself, as he goes on a spiritual journey commissioned by God through the realms of the afterlife, with the express purpose of chronicling them. To mirror Catholicism's three stages of the afterlife, the Divine Comedy is split into three books, with each book dealing with one of those three realms. Today we'll be focusing on Book 1, which is Inferno, a record of Dante's passage through hell. Before we can sink our teeth into this wild and wonderful tale, I have a few more things to get out of the way. First, Dante often uses his own story as a soapbox from which he virtue signals and professes his own takes on doctrine, politics, and general world affairs. The Divine Comedy is not considered Catholic canon, nor does it claim to be. So remember that ultimately, this is a work of fiction. I will repeat, it is a work of fiction, and that it does not always reflect the actual doctrinal points of the Catholic Church. Second, the Divine Comedy tells us a lot about the world at the time, and Dante's opinions on the goings-on of the day. Remember that these portions are just opinions, and that by nature, you are allowed to disagree with opinions. I'll do my best to make it clear when we are talking about one of those parts. Finally, let's briefly discuss the issue of translation. Obviously, the Divine Comedy was written in 14th century Italian, which is, you guessed it, definitely not English. As such, there are many different English translations to choose from, with certain people preferring some translations over others. For the sake of clarity, the translation I will be referencing in this episode is Mark Musa's translation. I find that it strikes a balance between remaining true to the original meaning and using more accessible, less archaic language. Okay, all that stuff is out of the way. Now we can finally begin. So, come with me as we embark on a macabre journey through the torturous depths of Dante's hell. But before that, one more thing. Thank you very much for watching, and I sincerely hope you enjoy. Inferno begins not in hell itself, but in a dark forest. There, Dante wakes up, not knowing where he is or how he got there. He begins to wander in search of an exit, and he is relieved to stumble across a sun-bathed hill leading out of the forest. However, as he starts the climb, he is confronted by 3 beasts who scare him away from climbing the hillside. He begins to sink into despair when a figure appears to comfort him. The figure introduces itself as Virgil. Yes, that Virgil, the Greek poet who wrote such great works as the Aeneid. Now, you may be asking yourself, of all people, why Virgil? The principal reason is pretty simple. Dante was a poet, and in poet circles, Virgil was, and still is, very highly regarded. Being scared and confused, Dante asks the obvious questions. Where is he, and how did he get there? Virgil tells him that he was sent by God to this place, and has been commissioned to carry out a divine mission. He also explains that the beasts guard the way out of the forest, letting no one escape until a prophecy is fulfilled in which a greyhound comes and chases them away. The symbolism of the greyhound is often debated, but I think it is a representation of some power driving away fear and doubt and unveiling the true way to salvation. It could very well be Dante himself, though there are other political figures who Dante supported that could also fit the bill. All that being said, though, Dante's journey out of this place clearly would not take him up that hill. Instead, Virgil informs him that they have to take what is, understatedly, the long way around, through hell and purgatory. Though he is certainly worried, Dante feels emboldened by Virgil's promise of guidance and counsel, so he accepts the quest, and the two walk into the forest. At length, they reach a gate with an inscription. I am the way into the doleful city. I am the way into eternal grief. I am the way to a forsaken place. Justice it was that moved my great creator. Divine omnipotence created me, and highest wisdom joined with primal love. Before me nothing but eternal things were made, and I shall last eternally. Abandon every hope, all ye who enter. Most of you probably recognize that last line. The Divine Comedy is, in fact, where this now recognizable phrase came from. So, if you didn't already know that, now you do. I'd like to talk a bit about this inscription because there's something quite interesting I'd like to discuss. In poetry, there are 2 kinds of classic narrative forms: tragedy and comedy. In a tragedy, the ending is sad and no one ends up happy, whereas everything works out okay in a comedy. And no, comedy doesn't mean funny in this case. Note how this is not the divine tragedy. It's the Divine Comedy. Everything is supposed to work out just fine in the end. The inscription actually serves as both a warning and a reminder of this fact. It was God who created hell, just as he created heaven, and this was done out of divine wisdom and love, though those things cannot satisfy the demands of holy justice. So hell must, of a necessity, exist, so that heaven may be. Make sure you keep this whole comedy thing in mind as we progress to the Inferno. At this point, Dante and his guides stand at the entrance, and the following scene is described. Here sighs and shrieks of lamentation echoed throughout the starless air of hell. At first these sounds resounding made me weep, tongues confused, a language strained in anguish with cadences of anger, shrill outcries and raucous groans that joined with sounds of hands, raising a whirlwind storm that turns itself forever through that air of endless black, like grains of sand swirling when a whirlwind blows. Dante is hearing the screams of the entire host of hell, an endless pit filled with damned souls whose number is beyond any hope of counting, all crying out in every language and tongue at once. In light of this incredibly bleak image, I'd like to remind you all, this is just at the entrance. They've barely even walked into hell, and their senses are already being assaulted by the tokens of unimaginable misery. Does it get worse? I guess we'll find out. But yes, it does get a whole lot worse. After this, Dante and Virgil, and by extension, we the audience, take their first steps into Inferno. Oh, it's also worth noting about how the Inferno is set up. It's essentially a downward spiral of increasingly deep circles, where the end of the spiral is the center of the earth, the furthest possible place from God and heaven. We'll get to all those juicy layers, but for now, the first site is what I have decided to call the Field of Nowhere. Here, there is an endless throng of people clamoring and sprinting around in pursuit of a blank banner which moves constantly around the area. Virgil reveals that this is the punishment for those who had no principles in life, no religion, nothing and no one they followed. The world will not record their having been there, in Virgil's words. So, as they were in life, they are made to do in death, chasing nothing for eternity. While they run around chasing the banner, flies and hornets sting them endlessly, causing a mixture of blood and tears to drop from them to the maggot-infested ground. Mind you, once again, this is just the first area. We're meant to look back at this later on in the story and say, you know what? Those banner chasers actually had it pretty good. A notable group of souls in this part of hell is that of angels. The explanation for this is that these angels chose to follow neither God nor Lucifer during the Great War in heaven, so they were condemned to the same fate as the other mortal fence-sitters. I guess Dante wasn't the biggest fan of indecision, which relates back to the politics of his home in Florence at the time. Contention between ideologically warring political factions caused political progress to stall, essentially going nowhere. My guess is that this indecision really rubbed Dante the wrong way, especially as an outsider looking in following his exile. During this journey, we will see many figures who Dante professes to recognize, but there is no one here that he recognizes save one, who Dante refers to only as the coward who had made the great refusal. The main speculation seems to be that this is likely to be Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor who refused to take sides on the issue of crucifying Christ, instead leaving it to the Jews to do with him as they pleased, resulting in his crucifixion and death. The two then arrive at the shores of the river Acheron. This brings up another interesting part of the Inferno: the coexistence of Christian characters alongside Greek and Roman mythology. In this case, Dante includes the myth of the Acheron River as the main river in Tartarus, which is basically the Greek hell, wherein an infernal boatsman named Acheron ferries the dead across the river to the underworld. Such is the case for Inferno, where Acheron fulfills the same responsibility. He initially doesn't want to take Virgil and Dante across the river, but Virgil reprimands him and reminds him that a higher power has willed this journey to come to pass, and Acheron complies begrudgingly. Virgil explains Acheron's attitude in this line: "A good soul never comes to make this crossing. So, if Acheron grumbles at the sight of you, you see now what his words are really saying." At this point, Dante is hit with a foul wind and faints. And not for the last time. Time and time again, especially in the beginning of the story, it's pretty clear that Dante does not have very thick skin and will faint at pretty much anything. When his senses return to him, they have arrived on the other side of the Acheron and are just outside the first circle of hell. Virgil explains to Dante who ends up here and what their punishment is. "You do not ask what sort of souls are these you see around you. Now you should know before we go on farther, they have not sinned. But their great worth alone was not enough, for they did not know baptism, which is the gateway to the faith you follow. And if they came before the birth of Christ, they did not worship God the way one should. I myself am a member of this group. For this defect, and for no other guilt, we here are lost. In this alone we suffer. Cut off from hope, we live on in desire." Basically, nothing bad really happens to people in Limbo besides not being able to ever see God, since they're in, hell. It seems like a fairly harsh stance to take that you could end up here if you simply live before Christ, but to be honest, Yeah, it just seems harsh. Limbo also provides a good place in the narrative for Dante to put people he likes, but couldn't put in heaven because of the rules of hell. The most notable figures of these are Virgil, of course, other poets like Ovid, Averroes, and Homer, Hector, the once king of Troy, philosophers like Plato, Aristotle, and Heraclitus, and Julius Caesar, the once emperor of Rome, who was infamously murdered on the Ides of March by the Roman Senate. We'll see this crop up again later on, but for now, remember this little fun fact. Dante likes Caesar. He really likes Caesar. Anyway, as they enter, they're approached by a group of who are presumably Dante's favorite poets, and they invite him to walk with them, which he considers to be a great honor. They talk and walk through a large castle and 7 gates within the castle walls, at which point the poets leave Virgil and Dante, and the two now behold a place where no light is. The rest of hell awaits our heroes. Guarding the entrance to the second circle is Minos, another figure from Greek mythology. In life, or should I say in the myth, he was the king of Crete and one of the many sons of the god Zeus. In death, though, he had become a demonic, beastly figure who guards the entrance to the second circle of the Inferno. By the way, this idea was not Dante's, but Virgil's. He wrote about Minos guarding the underworld in the Aeneid. Just thought that was a cool parallel. Anyways, Minos' job is to judge how deep into hell the sinners who approach him will go. He does this by wrapping his tail around himself, with each full coil representing to what circle the sinner at hand is being sent. Very cool idea, right? Continuing on, when he notices Dante and Virgil, he tries to warn them against entering, and Virgil, just as with Charon, reminds him sternly of the sanctity of this voyage, at which point Minos lets them pass. What Dante sees next is enough to make him faint again. The infernal storm, eternal in its rage, sweeps and drives the spirits with its blast. It whirls them, lashing them with punishment. Basically, a giant tornado violently throws the sinners here through the air. The sin of which they are guilty is lust. So, just as they allowed themselves to be driven about by their passions in life, in hell they are whisked away here and there with no control. There are a few figures of note here, including Cleopatra, Helen of Troy, and Achilles, but the most important ones are the two he talks to. Dante sees them and recognizes them as being from Ravenna, the place where he was living following his exile from Florence, and he calls them over to him. They share their story, saying that they're here because of a scandalous love affair that they were caught indulging in by the man's brother. Enraged, he killed them both immediately, though they include this interesting foreshadowing. Caina awaits the one who quenched our lives. We'll talk more about this later, but for now, suffice to say, Caina is a much lower part of hell reserved for those who betray and or murder their own family. I bring this up because Dante is sneakily introducing a new idea. The souls of the living can be sentenced to a circle of hell while they're still alive. More on that later. Dante, of course, faints after hearing the story of the lovers and hearing their bitter, heartbroken weeping. Classic Dante. The last circle was reserved for the lustful, so following the apparent pattern of cardinal sins, Dante regains his consciousness in the third circle, where the gluttons are punished. Here, it would seem that those guilty of the sin of gluttony are laying down in the mud. And that's when they notice the big dog. That is, the big 3-headed dog. That's right, Dante included Cerberus in this story, and not just as an Easter egg reference with no bearing on the story. In fact, Cerberus is the means of punishment in this circle, as his job is to furiously and violently maul any and all souls in the area. It's also worth noting that Cerberus appears to be injured. More on that later. The sinful souls of the third circle, having spent their lives in gluttony, are now eternally subject to the horrible appetite of this monster. When the brute turns to our two journeymen and begins another assault, the quick-thinking Virgil throws, mud into its mouth? Oh, that can't be right. But there it is, written in black and white. Mud. How? Anyways, Virgil throws some mud into one of its mouths, which seems to calm it down. It's at this point that we meet someone who recognizes Dante, a fellow Florentine. Like I already mentioned, Dante is going to take any opportunity he can to talk about his beloved Florence, and this will not be the last we hear about Florence in this story, so you'd better get used to it. The man says his name is Ciacco, who simply says that he is down in the third circle for being a gluttonous sinner. Dante then asks him what will happen to Florence. Without missing a beat, Chiaco says matter-of-factly that the warring parties will have a violent confrontation, after which one of them will completely dominate and subjugate the other to rule Florence. Dante presses him for more information by asking about some of their other deceased friends, but the doleful Chiaco coldly replies, "They lie below with blacker souls, by different sins pushed down to different depths. If you keep going, you may see them all, but when you are once more in the sweet world, I beg you to remind our friends of me." Despite Inferno being such a gruesome story, I really felt the emotion behind that line. I beg you to remind our friends of me. Imagine being in a state of endless torture and mutilation at the hands of a three-headed hellhound from Greek mythology, and your only source of solace, the only comfort even remotely available to you, is to have an old friend remember you. Having said what he needed to say, Chiaco sinks down into the mud, awaiting the inevitable return of Cerberus. As he returns to his fellow sinners, Virgil says, "He'll wake no more until the day the angel's trumpet blows, when the unfriendly judge shall come down here. Each soul shall again find his wretched tomb, assume his flesh, and take his human shape, and hear his fate resound eternally." As Dante and Virgil start to leave the third circle, Dante asks Virgil about what the punishment for the unrighteous will look like after Judgment Day. Virgil replies, essentially, that as both mercy and justice get closer to perfection, the state of happiness or suffering also approaches perfection. Therefore, at the last day, the happiness of the saints shall be perfect, and the punishment of the sinners shall also be perfect. And on that note, they exit the third circle of hell and approach the next area. On a cliff overlooking the fourth circle of hell is Plutus, the Roman god of wealth and riches. He chants at the passers-by, clucking, "Pape Satan, Pape Satan alepe." The meaning or translation of this phrase, according to the thorough research others have done on the matter, is unclear. The safest bet seems to be that it's meant to be a chant glorifying Satan, the father of all sin. Virgil does as he has done several times already and reprimands the fallen god, reminding him that this mission was ordained of God and heaven. And with that, Plutus collapses to the earth, and Virgil and Dante continue along their way. A field comes into view where the souls condemned to this circle endlessly bash each other with huge boulders that they're rolling around. They are constantly bickering and screaming at each other as they beat themselves senseless. The sin they've committed, according to Virgil, is that of both avarice and miserliness. That is to say, people who spent money too freely and people who hoarded it. Upon seeing such a terrible sight, Dante asks Virgil if they could stop momentarily so he could see if he recognized any of the souls here. But Virgil explains, "Yours is an empty hope. Their undistinguished life that made them foul now makes it harder to distinguish them." He's implying that these spirits have been battered beyond all recognition due to their ceaseless brawl. He then laments humanity's greed for money and material goods, saying, "All the gold that is or ever was beneath the moon won't buy a moment's rest for even one among these weary souls." Money, then, has its limit. It cannot buy everything, and in this case, it cannot buy these souls their way out of hell. Dante and Virgil's next stop is the river Styx, which Dante describes as being more like a swamp. This lines up with Greek myths about Tartarus and the underworld, which bear a river of the same name. As they walk closer to the shore, Dante notices that in the stagnant water of the Styx are countless people. The river acts as the fifth circle, which is reserved for those who were wrathful and driven by anger in life. As punishment, they sit in the river, some of them even underwater, as Virgil points out via the occasional bubbles in the river, bogged down eternally by the mud of one of hell's rivers. The two walk around the bank of the river until they reach a tower, which is in the process of signaling another tower from across the river using two flames. The signal is for the ferryman, Phlegius, yet another figure from Greek mythology, who swiftly comes over in his boat to pick up the two infernal travelers. While Phlegius was initially excited to see the souls he was about to ferry, Virgil informs him, as he always must, I suppose, that they are on a special mission. Phlegius gets very angry, but still allows them aboard and begins the trip across the river. I always get a kick out of this next part. While they're traveling, a spirit rises from the mud and asks, "Who are you who come before your time?" Dante recognizes this person as someone from Florence who is quite stuck up, and rebukes him, telling him to get away from the boat, in not so many words. Virgil praises Dante for chastising that soul, and as the boat floats away on the water, the soul of that man, whose name in life was Filippo Argenti, gets torn to shreds by others and himself. biting whole chunks of his own flesh out of anger. I have two things to say about this interaction. First, it seems like the people in this circle may have also had a bit of a pride complex in life, and not just an anger management problem. Second, and most amusingly, Filippo Argenti was a real person in Dante's life, who he did not like for one reason or another, and apparently whatever Dante disliked him for was a good enough reason for him to end up in the fifth circle of hell in Dante's own book. I imagine a sort of Sunday morning situation in the Argenti household where Filippo is reading the Inferno and spits out his frosted flakes everywhere when he reads that Dante put him this far down in hell. Very funny stuff. Anyways, with Filippo disposed of appropriately, the pair finally arrive at the far shore of the Styx, where the walls of the city of Dis stand menacingly before them. Dante notices the glow of burning fires from within the city's gates, and Virgil says that eternal fire burns within, giving off the reddish glow you see diffused throughout this lower hell. Virgil approaches the gate to speak with the gatekeepers, but they very quickly slam it in his face, as they aren't too keen on letting Dante, a living soul, pass through. Both Dante and Virgil are a bit distraught, but Virgil keeps his hopes up, saying that surely heaven will send help to ensure that their journey continues. Some time passes, and still our heroes sit waiting anxiously for the help Virgil promised would come. Virgil continues his reassurances, even sharing the story about the first time he came through hell to retrieve the soul of a traitor from a deeper circle on behalf of a witch, though Dante doesn't really seem to be comforted by this. Big shock there. Suddenly, out of nowhere, come a group of 3 harpies, flying beast women of Greek mythology, who use their nails to tear at their own bodies as they scream at the 2 travelers. They start to call for Medusa, yet another Greek mythological figure whose hair is made of snakes and whose gaze turns the living to stone. Virgil, who is beginning to panic at this point, turns Dante away from the harpies and covers his eyes, lest Medusa herself arrive and turn Dante to stone. It is at this very moment that an extremely loud blast rips through the cursed air of hell. Virgil uncovers Dante's eyes, saying, "Now turn around and set your sight along the ancient scum, there, where the marsh's mist is hovering thickest." There, walking on the surface of the foul river, was the help Virgil had promised in the form of an angel. It approaches the gate, swings it open without resistance, and yells, "O heaven's outcasts, despicable souls, what insolence is this that breeds in you? Why do you stubbornly resist that will whose end can never be denied, and which, more than one time, has increased your suffering? What do you gain by locking horns with fate? If you remember well, your Cerberus still bears his chin and throat peeled clean for that." Remember how Cerberus looked wounded all the way back in Circle 3? Well, here the angel is referencing how he got those injuries in the first place. In the Greek myth of Hercules, one of the great feats he performed was to go to the underworld to rescue the soul of Theseus, another Greek hero, but he was accosted by Cerberus, so he did what he had to do. He wrapped a chain around its neck and dragged it around until its skin was flayed off from the stomach to the throat. I find it very interesting that Dante is forcing Greek and Roman mythology and Catholic Christianity to exist in the same narrative, since it creates more problems than it solves, especially when it comes to continuity, but I digress. I guess it's just cool that Hercules gets an indirect shout out from one of God's angels here. After this, the angel leaves the way it came, and the 2 are allowed to pass through the now open gate and continue their descent into the deeper parts of hell. And with that, we have reached the conclusion of Part 1. While we managed to cover a great deal of unique and creative ways of suffering, torture, mutilation, and general pain, trust me, it gets more bizarre and painful and creative from here. But that's for next time. In the meantime, make sure you like and subscribe, and keep a lookout for Part 2, because there's more of this tale to tell. I'm Philip, this has been On Thin Ice, and again, thank you for watching.